Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming out today. I'm Naomi Schaefer Riley, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Here at AEI, we are very committed to researching and recommending policies that help the most vulnerable members of our society. In the case of adoption, that often means two groups of people. The mothers who, for one reason or another, cannot care for the children that they have given birth to, and of course the children themselves who are in need of loving hearts and hands to care for them. Though the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade in June did not commend adoption in particular, it has certainly touched off a heated national conversation on this issue. Justice Barrett's passing reference to safe haven laws to suggest that forced parenting is not the only alternative to abortion has sparked quite a bit of outrage, actually. One Democratic strategist wrote, quote, "Adoption is often just as traumatic as the right thinks abortion is, if not more so, as a woman has to relinquish not a lump of cells, but a fully formed baby she has lived with for 9 months." Another commentator explained, "I would rather get an abortion than have a brown child who ends up being adopted by white evangelicals. It is not a kindness to children of the global majority to give them to people who will traumatize them with self and ancestral hatred." But I don't think inflammatory tweets and op-eds are the way to form public policy about adoption. So just a few facts to help us get started this morning. Almost half of the 6 million pregnancies in the US each year are unintended. The vast majority of those mothers carry those children to term and raise them. There are about 1 million abortions a year in the United States, and only about 18,000 children under the age of 2 who are placed with adoption agencies. The number of adoptions and abortions has actually been falling for years with the loss of stigma against single motherhood. More women are, of course, choosing to raise babies they might, in a previous era, have chosen either to abort or place for adoption. There is actually a lot we don't know about the choices that women make, the role of medical professionals, adoption agencies, religious leaders, and public opinion informing these decisions. The Dobbs decision has touched off political firestorms in almost every state in the country. But if politics is downstream of culture, then we must first understand the culture around adoption before we can see the role it will play in our laws. So one final note before I get to our experts today. You should stay tuned because for the past year, AEI has actually been working with the polling firm NORC to do our own original adoption research as well, partnering with the Spence Chapin Adoption Agency in New York to learn more about the experiences of birth mothers. We hope to be able to share the results of that survey with you in the next few months. So now I want to turn it over to our esteemed panel. Our first guest is Ryan Hanlon. He's the president of the National Council for Adoption. Then we will hear from John Knox. He's the founder of the Opt Institute, a nonprofit research foundation and think tank devoted to improving access to and support for private infant adoption. And finally, we'll hear from Elizabeth Kirk. She is the director of the Center for Law and the Human Person at Catholic University. We're going to hear brief remarks from each of our panelists. Then the four of us are going to have a discussion, and then we are going to turn it over to the audience for questions. So get your questions ready. So with that, Ryan, take it away. Oh, wait, I have one final note. For those of you who are interested, Ryan's going to talk a little bit about his report, and if you're interested on your way out, we have copies of the report for you, so be sure to pick those up.
Yeah, thank you, Naomi. Thanks for you all being here. It's a real honor to be able to talk about this. And what I want to do at first is really just lay the groundwork for what adoption looks like in our country. Naomi has started telling us about this. Many people don't know that the most common type of adoption is adoption from foster care. And so when we're thinking about adoption and who is being placed for adoption in this country, nearly 60,000 kids are placed for adoption each year from the foster care system. About a third as many children are placed for a private infant domestic adoption. An equal number of children are part of a step-parent adoption, and then just a small fraction, a couple thousand kids each year would be placed for an inter-country adoption. And so often when I'm talking to people, they think it's the exact opposite. They think that most adoptions are coming from overseas, and after that, there's a lot of infant adoptions, and then there are some kids who are adopted from the foster care system. So just to get a sense of who's being placed for adoption and what adoption looks like in our country, that can help us think through that. And then when you look statistically at the nation as a whole, 1% to 2% of adults are adopted. So most of us know somebody in our life, either in our extended family, in our workplace, who is themselves an adopted person. Naomi mentioned our research report. We were surprised it ended up being the largest study of adoptive households ever. We heard from over 4,200 adoptive parents who had adopted over 6,600 children, and we asked them about their household size. We asked a lot of demographic questions. We asked about their experiences with their adoption, how much it cost, what the process was like, and we asked them about what their post-adoption experience has been like. And we did that because, as Naomi has stated, often we hear about adoption anecdotally. We hear about somebody's really good experience. We hear about somebody's really terrible experience, but we don't have a lot of data about what these households look like, who is being adopted, and who's doing the adoption. And so we wanted to get a baseline of information about who these families are. And our report has, given some, but certainly not all of the information we need there. And we're reviewing that as really part one of a three-part series where we are also going to be hearing from birth parents and also hearing directly from adoptees. Some of the things that came out of this report are, for me, very fascinating. So we see that adoptive parents are themselves very, very highly educated. They often are wealthier than other families in the United States. Most of them already have other children in their home when they adopt. So this is not a practice that's driven by a couple with no children in their home, or often the stereotype is a couple who has experienced infertility. Instead, most adoptive households are already parenting when they complete their adoption, and many, not quite half, pursue adoption for more than one child, or they adopt it multiple times to grow their family. For international adoption, we see that there's been a huge increase in the number of special needs adoption, even while the overall number of adoptions has significantly decreased, almost to the point where, well, actually beginning in 2014, the majority of international adoptions were of a child who has a medical special need. For private domestic adoption, there's been a huge increase in the number of families that have an ongoing relationship between the birth family and the adoptive family. So we compared last decade to the decade prior, and there was a 20% increase. So now 3/4 or more of families who do these adoptions have an ongoing relationship with the birth family. The vast, vast majority of adoptive families, regardless of the type of adoption, report that they have a really good experience. The way they would phrase it through hearing from them is that if they knew everything that they knew, looking back, they would still have made the exact same decision. We see that adoptees do very well in school settings. They're often partaking in some type of an educational accommodation, such as an IEP or a 504 plan. They also, according to their parents, are doing exceptionally well in school. They have good, often very good or excellent ratings by their parents in terms of their academic performance. So that's just a brief snapshot. The report contains a lot more information. I hope to look at a lot more. And as we're going and talking more, I do have a lot to say about this political climate as well. So I hope we can get to that, but I'll turn things over to John for now.
Thank you, Ryan and Naomi. My name is John Knox. I'm an adopted kid, and I spent 40 years in the surety bond business, building and selling insurance companies. And after I sold my last company and decided what I was going to do, I knew I was an ultimate failure at unemployment, so I needed to do something. And so I started focusing on adoption. And I got involved. I met with Ryan's predecessor at the National Council for Adoption and different CEOs of agencies around the country, and I was amazed at what was going on with adoption. When I was adopted in the 50s, there were hundreds of thousands of kids who were adopted. And Naomi mentioned less than 20,000 were adopted annually now. And I thought that just can't be right when I first learned those numbers. And saw that the last time it had actually been counted had been in 2014. And so I knew we needed to get up to date and new information. The National Council for Adoption was willing to do a new updated study. And so I ended up forming the Opt Institute, which helped fund that study. And it also funded George Barna to do a study on adoption. I wanted to know, why are people not choosing adoption today? And what's wrong? How is it viewed in society? We've actually done 4 different research reports that were all released in 2020. And to me, it's been fascinating to see the millennials, their view, their perceptions, how things are looking. There's 30 million women out there today that don't know that they get to pick the family. We're not doing a great job at explaining to people about how adoption works today. The things Ryan was just talking about in terms of having open relationships and communication, in terms of how it works today and what a woman's choice are today, is what continues to show up in the research that is really surprising to me. The women overwhelmingly talked about that they wanted to do what was in the best interest of the child, but then they don't pick adoption, which from my experience has been a fabulous thing of what you can do for the child. We started a program that's called I Am That Kid, which are people like me who have told their stories, and we're continuing to have the stories of Olympic athletes, pro athletes, top business people, different leaders at House that have come along, and I'm learning that their stories are very similar to mine, and that they've had tremendous success, and they view adoption in an extremely positive way. We've found through the research that it's confused with foster care. You've got birth mothers, when you say, what do you think about placing your child for adoption? They think of the foster care system, and we get quotes back on saying, well, I would never put my child in that system. Well, no logical person ever would into the foster care system. That's a terrible place, which my focus is on private infant adoption, and so that's what we've been focusing on. And as we've gone down that road, we've also started learning that private, just the name of it, a private infant adoption, makes people think it was closeted and closed and back like it was back when I was adopted. We see a lot of the articles that are being written today that are very negative about adoption, and they're going back and they're talking about ways that it used to be, as opposed to the ways that Ryan just described it, how it is today. And that's what we need to educate people on. And so what I'm focusing on lately is utilizing open adoption and talking about open adoption as opposed to private, because we don't want people to be thinking that it's a closed or secret type of event. And we're going to have campaigns that are going to push that forward. I'm really excited that the large agencies in the country are all excited in supporting this, including people like Schaefer and Gladney and Nightlife Christian Adoptions and Brave Love, who focuses a lot on the birth mothers' stories, that are all very excited about kind of pushing the narrative forward of open adoption in our society today. I'm excited to get to do that and put my time, talent, and resources behind it. Thanks.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Okay, thank you, Naomi, for having me. You won't be surprised as the law professor that I have some written remarks, so bear with me. But first, I just want to mention that, like John and many others involved in the adoption world, I too have a personal connection in addition to my professional interest in adoption law and policy. I am an adopted person. My mom got pregnant with me in college unexpectedly, and my birth father exited stage left, we'll say. And my dad adopted me when I was 3, when he married my mother. And so I, from a very early age, had a very positive experience of adoption through the example and gift of my dad's fatherhood. My husband and I are also parents to 4 children through adoption. 3 we brought home at birth, and our last little guy from foster care. So it's something that, in addition to being professionally important to me, is also personally very close to my heart. So just in terms of the role of adoption post-Dobbs, I think, adoption is in the news a lot in the context of abortion. My focus in my remarks is on women's decision-making I think, we could talk a lot about, and this Profiles in Adoption is so great as of a resource to talk about the number of adoptive parents waiting, what they look like, the sorts of motivations they have. I think that's really important. But my focus is, as I said, on the women's decision-making, especially vis-a-vis abortion. On the pro-life side, post-Dobbs, many promote adoption as a life-giving alternative to abortion, so one that respects both the humanity of the child, but also honors the duties of care that the mother has to her child. Justice Barrett's question, I think, caused a lot of controversy, but in part it was born out of the legal justifications in both Roe and Casey for abortion rested in part on whether women need abortion, right, in order to flourish in society. And if she has alternatives, one, as a legal matter, would want to know, well, does she in fact need abortion? I think that was really what was behind her questions. Many on the pro-choice side also claimed that adoption can be common ground. President Obama was known to say this in many occasions, that it can be common ground in the fraught abortion wars, and that the law ought to do more to make adoption more accessible. And then there are those, of course, that reject it altogether, saying that it's inherently coercive or exploitive of women. Naomi mentioned a couple of quotes. I'll just offer another. There's been a recent slew of articles criticizing pregnancy resource centers, and one said, while there's a growing awareness of how these centers hinder abortion access, the centers have a broader agenda that is less well known. They seek not only to induce women to choose life, but to choose adoption. Conservative Christian agencies demonstrate a pattern and history of coercing women to relinquish their children. So this is the sort of lay of the land post-Dobbs and the different ways in which adoption is being spoken about. Adoption does have this sort of broad cultural appeal. 86% of Americans have a favorable to extremely favorable view of the institution of adoption. But as has already been mentioned, despite this, very few people choose it, either as a way of responding to a crisis pregnancy or as a way of building a family. The numbers have already been thrown out there. In 2020, there were at least 930,160 abortions. I say at least because there are some states that don't report. The number of infants placed for private domestic adoption, according to the National Council for Adoption's recent adoption by the numbers, that same year was 19,658. So the ratio of annual abortions to adoptions is nearly 50-1. I find that number astounding. So I think this wildly disproportionate number of abortions to adoptions reveal that most women don't consider adoption as a meaningful option, especially vis-a-vis abortion. Why? I think vis-a-vis parenting, we can certainly point to the bond, the natural bond between the mother and the baby. There's more there, but why don't women choose adoption, especially over abortion? There are many complex factors for this. A study published in the Journal of Family Issues, which is published by the Guttmacher Institute, which was analyzing women's motivations to abort, stated that without being asked directly, several of the women indicated that adoption is not a realistic option for them. They reported that the thought of one's child being out in the world without knowing if it was being taken care of or by whom would induce more guilt than having an abortion. So to John's point, I think this demonstrates that there are serious misunderstandings about the contemporary practice of adoption, such as the misimpression that families who place their children for adoption will have no contact with the baby or even know where she has been placed. Another misunderstanding that John mentioned is that many conflate private adoption with foster care. One of my children's birth moms for a while, when adoption was initially presented to her, said, no, I don't want my child in the system, right? Only when the notion of adoption in which she had agency was described to her was she willing to consider it. So there's also studies that indicate that most women who choose adoption never considered abortion, or if they did, they had already decided to carry the child to term before turning to adoption, so a sort of sequential series of decisions. And only at some point later do they consider adoption after abortion is off the table. So I think we can say that if abortion is off the table, and this is where it becomes relevant post-Dobbs, because in many states it is off the table, adoption may become a more realistic option. One study found that 91% of women denied an abortion due to gestational limits. This is coming out of the turn-away studies. That 91% of women turned away choose to parent, and only 9% place for adoption. And this study has been used a lot for the proposition to show that, see, women don't want adoption, right? That women denied abortion, the vast majority of them are going to parent. And the researcher said that, therefore, promotion of adoption as an alternative to abortion is not likely grounded in the reality of women's decision-making. But I think if we dig into the data a bit, with abortion on the table, of the women who don't parent, right, of the women who either choose abortion or choose adoption, only 2% of women choose adoption. In other words, 98% of women, with abortion on the table, 98% of women who don't, for whatever reason, can't or don't want to parent, 98% of them choose abortion. When we compare it to parenting, less than half of 1% place a child for adoption. So I think 9% is actually a huge increase, right? That it demonstrates that with abortion off the table, adoption does play a meaningful role. Yes, vis-a-vis parenting, it's always going to be a less popular choice, but I think we must be prepared for this in those states that restrict heavily abortion. Just to kind of conclude, but with abortion on the table, adoption is the non-option. And I think a lot about this, whether there's anything we can do to change that dynamic, especially because post-Dobbs, nearly half the country will maintain access to legal abortion. And I suspect, although I think this is worth conversation, that in a culture shaped for the last half century by the availability of abortion, especially with its emphasis on individual autonomy and the primacy of the woman's needs, that choosing adoption is not only naturally very difficult, but entirely countercultural. As John said, it requires giving equal consideration to the best interest of the child and perhaps recognizing the risk of harm that abortion poses to the woman. I think there's very little about the pro-choice position that persuasively encourages women to think about abortion. And we see Planned Parenthood has 82 abortions for every one adoption referral. And even those in the pro-life pregnancy resource world report that they don't bring up adoption for fear that a woman who hasn't already decided to carry to term will then be induced to abort. So instead, they focus on resources available for parenting. But again, once parenting is off the table, with abortion on the table, that's going to be their choice. So I think, I think there's more that we could talk about in terms of these attitudes. I think to the extent adoptions are rejected because of these misunderstandings or misimpressions, that there's much we can do in education and law and policy to correct those misunderstandings. I think there's much we can do to sort of push back at the soft stigma, the narrative that placing your child for adoption is abandoning your child, that it makes you a bad mother. I think there's an enormous amount that we can do. I have a policy paper published by the Charlotte Lozier Institute where I recommended a number of specific pro-adoption initiatives that might be appropriate depending on the state, depending on whether it's federal or state, and I'd be happy to share those in more detail. I won't go over those now. But yeah, I'm just grateful for the interest and the renewed interest in adoption and look forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to just sort of focus in on one group of women in particular now. So in thinking about the overlap between kind of the foster care system and private infant adoption, which is to say, let's say you have a state where abortion does become significantly more restricted. Should we be concerned about women who, decide to parent even though they have a history of involvement with the child welfare system? Maybe they've had children who've been previously removed from their custody, either temporarily or permanently. Not that it is forced parenting necessarily, but Is there a way to talk to those women about the option of adoption without it seeming, of private adoption, without it seeming coercive, in the sense that, other children have previously been removed from their care? We are concerned maybe about the possibility that a future child born to this woman might be in some kind of danger. I want to kind of just focus in on that group of women, because in terms of how the legislation that is changing in these states might actually affect one group, that's one that has kind of come to my attention. And I wonder, how all three of you might think about that group of women in particular, who are in some ways the most vulnerable, and also having children who might be put into the most vulnerable situations.
I don't mind. Do you want to go ahead?
I mean, I have something to say, but you can go.
I'll go after you.
No, I mean, I think it's a really important question, and I think it's not easy to talk about. I think, I don't have the statistic handy, but it's something like a quarter of children coming into foster care each year are under one, right? So demonstrating that it may be the case that a number of women or parents are ill-prepared for parenting, right? How to present, I mean, I think just overall, women don't consider adoption as a meaningful option. They don't know enough about it. It needs to be presented in general. But I think that, there's a real danger in this space. I mean, I want to emphasize the woman's agency, right? That she can pick the family, that all these things. And I think presented in that way to a woman who may be vulnerable to foster care, that can be very appealing. But there's also a soft pressure, right? For, and there's been articles written about this, for parents who are vulnerable, do they sort of feel like they have no choice, that they have to relinquish a child or else they'll be in foster care? So I think there is this delicate way in which it needs to be presented. I would emphasize the role of agencies, of organizations like Safe Families for Children, which is an organization that's meant to provide respite care for families who are in crisis so that they don't fall into foster care. And better support and knowledge of organizations like that might give families who are otherwise vulnerable to foster care the opportunity to kind of take stock, see whether or not they are in fact prepared for parenting, that sort of breathing room that they need in order to make a fully informed and the best decision for everybody.
Yeah, and what I would say is there are some states that do allow this, and states like Florida come to mind, states like South Carolina, that's allowed. Most states don't have a process or don't allow those types of placements to happen. And so in that situation, women have fewer choices. They don't have the empowerment to say, I think what's in my child's best interest or in my best interest is to make this placement. So I'm supportive of states changing their laws to do that. I share the concern that could be a very coercive situation.
Can you be more specific? What are you saying that Florida and South Carolina have that these other states don't have? What is the language?
For a child who's if a child's in the child welfare system, the birth parent can work to do a private voluntary placement of that child outside of that system. So she could still choose the parents, and that could still be a legally finalized adoption. There's a system or a process where that can happen. Mm-hmm. Most states, that's not an option. And so in those states, these women, it's usually just women, but sometimes it's the birth father or the birth parents. They have fewer options there. Of course, it can be a very coercive situation, as you were alluding to. If your child is in the child welfare system and someone comes to you and says, you've had previous kids removed, you should do this, that can be really challenging. And so we would want to make sure we're approaching that in a manner where she is very informed, where she understands what her options are, and she's empowered to and has the space and ability to think through the short-term and long-term consequences of those decisions. But it might be a great option for her to have her child with the type of parents that she wants. It might be a great option for her to be able to continue to have an ongoing relationship with her child. It's going to be far more likely in that scenario, statistically speaking, than the ability to maintain a relationship if that child's placed for adoption, by the child welfare system years later after parental rights are terminated. And so for her to be able to take stock of her life and say, this is what's best for me, this is what's best for my child, we should have options to do that. We just need to approach it very mindfully to ensure that we aren't being coercive and we aren't being overly directive in terms of what should be happening there.
Did you want to add something, Chuck?
Yeah, I agree, Naomi, that doing it in a non-coercive way is the right way to communicate that. And I think you're correct thinking about it, about those in the system that you're talking about, but also for women overall. If we can communicate that adoption or open adoption is empowering to women in terms of them making that choice. If we can help communicate how wonderful it is of those of us that have been adopted being able to share the stories and the information with people on what it is, you've opened up their ability of making that choice. And I think that's a shift as society that we need to make. I think it's the core of what we need to do to make that shift to where people can see that they get to pick the family, that they get to negotiate the relationship on what that's going to be, and that's in the best interest of the child. And overall, women are saying that what's in the best interest of the child, and we need to show them that adoption is wonderfully based. A lot of people that even have a biblical worldview don't think that it's biblically based to place a child for adoption, which is crazy because we've got examples throughout the book that talk about that it's absolutely an intended plan and can be a fabulous plan that should be considered.
So, Ryan, I want to dig a little bit more into the report. A lot of the kind of very tense conversation about adoption is around race. And I know you did some interesting, you asked some interesting questions, and you can share with us maybe some of the statistics around people's views of adoption broken down by race, and also, how much transracial adoption is occurring in this country, those kind of things. If you can just sort of give us some kind of baseline knowledge about how much of our conversation about adoption should be about race.
Yeah. So that's a great question. The majority of children who are placed for adoption are white, or it's about 50% of the children that are placed for adoption are white. When we asked a lot of questions for families that where the child was a different race than the parents. So if at least one of the parent was the same race, they weren't asked this question. But if both parents were a different race, we asked them about how they participated in different activities, or how they chose to incorporate aspects of the racial and ethnic heritage that would be true for their child. And we looked at it by type of adoption. And so it's things like, do they have other friends who share that child's racial or ethnic or cultural background? Are they participating in holidays or events that reflect that child's race or ethnicity? And overwhelmingly, the answer was yes. They are finding ways to do that. Not in every question we asked was it overwhelming, but it was the vast majority. For every type of adoption, they're looking for ways to do that, which doesn't mean we don't have room to improve in that regard. But what we wanted to do, again, was to lay just like a baseline, because this is, as you said, often talked about, but we don't really have a sense for what's actually happening. How are these families doing? What are their experiences? We sometimes hear from often adult adoptees who are reflecting what their experience was like as a child, and I think everyone's story is something that we can learn from and has validity, but we don't want to be basing policy off of an anecdote. And we also need to understand that's a snapshot of what adoption and parenting looked like 20, 30, 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so understanding also what does it look like now and how has this changed. I think as an adoption professional, our field has changed where we are doing a better job of helping parents understand that there are implications about having a family where the parents are a different race than the child, and helping the parents understand ways that they can approach parenting differently and be talking to their kids about race differently, and be talking to the child about the fact that he or she might not look the same as other kids in their class or other members of their family, and to have more conversations. We weren't doing that 30 years ago. We weren't doing that at all. Or the conversations we were having were such that the parents would say, well, things like, I don't see color. I don't notice that my child's a different race, which is silly, but that's actually what parents would say. And so the children who were raised in those homes would, understandably say, my parents didn't prepare me for the world. There were issues with the way they raised me. I love my parents, but they got that really wrong. That's a common thing that we would hear. And so parents are doing a much better job now than they used to in that regard. Statistically speaking, it's going to be far more common for inter-country adoption. The majority of inter-country adoptions are going to have families that look like that. From foster care, it's not nearly the same, and for private domestic adoption, even less so.
John, I wonder whether we know anything about the attitudes about adoption, how they vary across race and just in terms of public opinion polls.
I don't remember the statistics. There was some of that in the Barna research in terms of that particularly showed that the Black community had much lower opinion of adoption and struggle with that. I don't know what's driving those attitudes or what the reason is for that, but it was pretty bold in his report.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Did you haven't measured that in your?
No, we haven't.
Okay.
We plan on measuring that also by hearing from birth parents, as I
Right.
mentioned, and from adoptees themselves. But we haven't asked, because we were hearing from adoptive parents. We weren't polling the general population as part of this research.
Right. Okay. I wanted to turn to the question of religion and kind of what the role is of religion in thinking about this. Do we know how religious institutions are talking about adoption, if they're talking about adoption? And also what role religious leaders are playing or religious counselors are playing in the decisions of women? Does religion make it more likely that a religious woman would be more likely to place a child for adoption, or that a family would be more likely to adopt? How much is religion driving adoption in this country?
The Barna research would indicate that it's not driving it very much. I mean, in terms of who influences women today, that was one of the most surprising things that were in there. And when you get outside of the family, it was the medical community. I would have thought that the friends, peers, the internet, those types of things would have been the highest influencers. It was the medical community. Doctors were first. And counselors, therapists, other people were another 20%. We tend to outsource parenting, right? If you've got a crisis, you go to the expert. If you've got a problem in school, you go to the tutor. Or you've got a different issue, you got ADD, you go to the doctor and get meds. You've got this, you got that, and so we outsource crisis, right? Or we outsource problems. And in the study of who influences women, the church was 12%.
Wow.
So it tells me the answer to your question is they're not influencing more. They did have a bigger influence on the 1 in 20 women who did say that they had a biblical worldview. Okay. So out of all of the women in the study, 1 in 20 said they had a biblical worldview. And those did score higher and were more prone towards adoption.
Mm-hmm. Elizabeth, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I echo everything that John said. I think in the individual decision-making, it may not play as important a role as we might hope. I do think, from the adoptive parent side that, in particular, I think Christian churches, or at least that's what I'm most familiar with, are a bold public witness, right, for the role of the view of welcoming the stranger, right? This is a way of practicing what we Catholics call corporal works of mercy, of adoption as a kind of radical form of hospitality, of welcoming the stranger into your home as your son or daughter. And as John said earlier, I mean, there's rich, beautiful scriptural support for adoption. And so I think churches do a good job of recruiting parents to become adoptive parents. But in terms of the women's decision making, I suspect it plays a much less important role.
I wonder, I mean,
Yeah.
I was trying to kind of parse the Barna research a little bit and try to figure out whether it's not, I mean, presumably some of these women just, have a worldview that tells them that they, should consider adoption, and maybe they don't end up going to a religious counselor specifically at that moment where they're making this decision. I just wonder whether it underestimated how much your religious views will play into this, even if it's not a religious figure who's advising you at that point.
And so what we looked at, we measured two different things in terms of religion. First, we just measured their religious affiliation. So somewhere between 11 to 15, 16% of parents, depending on the type of adoption, would say they had no religious affiliation. So obviously the rest have some religious affiliation. It was somewhere, again, by type of adoption, somewhere between 70 to 80+% who would describe themselves as either Protestant or Catholic, Christian. And the majority have religious affiliation, but it's not their primary motivation. That was the other thing we measured. What we asked questions about what is your motivation, and then from there, what was the primary motivation of all the different things that were chosen. And religious calling was pretty low on that list. It was behind things like providing a permanent home for the child, infertility, extending the family. It was not the primary thing that's driving this, and that's true for different types of adoption. It looked like it was a little bit more, like religious calling was more important for those who pursue intercountry adoption, but even then it wasn't the first or even second primary motivator for most of those families.
Mm-hmm.
If I could just add one more thing. I don't have a study on this, but I wonder, in part, the soft stigma that I mentioned against the choice of adoption for women. I wonder whether in some cases it's not reinforced by some religious views. I think there's a heavy emphasis, especially in conservative religious traditions, on the primacy of the natural family. And especially to kind of counter what we might now think of as alternate family structures or things like assisted reproductive technologies. And I think adoption often gets kind of conflated with that, and it, I think, could feed into the stigma that adoption is something that's unnatural, right? That to give your blood away is somehow makes you a bad mother. And so I do think that religious traditions ought to be more mindful of the way they speak about these things in order to distinguish adoption from perhaps these other.
I laughed because I'm sitting there thinking, I was adopted and it was really natural, right? I mean, my family was very natural. This wasn't an unnatural an unnatural thing, but I think you might be right, Elizabeth, that maybe some people are thinking of it that way from a mother's perspective. But I can guarantee you from the kid's perspective, being raised in a great home, that's what you want, right? You want to be raised in a happy family. You want to be raised by parents who provided you a great atmosphere. And when we have 700,000 families who want to adopt and 20,000 kids that are out there, there are a lot of great families. You mentioned 50 to 1, right? I mean, basically what that's saying is that a birth mother has 50 different families that she can pick from. And picking a happy family can become very natural.
I wanted to kind of ask a little bit about something you mentioned, John, which was the role of medical professionals in helping women make these decisions. I think you're probably right about your diagnosis that we will often turn to professionals to help us answer these big life questions. Do we know anything about kind of what doctors are saying to women about these questions? Do they feel comfortable? I mean, it's a legal question, but it's also, I think, very much a cultural question. Like, would you feel comfortable suggesting this to a patient? Are you allowed to suggest it to a patient? And what are the kind of general opinions in the medical community about adoption and mentioning it to your patients?
There's an organization called Family to Family Support Network that has surveyed medical providers, nurses, doctors, others, and found that only about 2% have received competent training about adoption. And so if that's true, they're not going to be then in a position to turn around and offer meaningful, accurate, helpful information to, again, usually just women, but birth parents who are considering that. And that's important that they would have good information so that they, if as John's research shows, they're often who this population's turning to for help. Well, let's make sure that those providers have good information so that they can be passing it on to the clients, the patients that they're serving. It's also, I think, something that the adoption field and society can be doing better. I talked about how there's more special needs adoptions. There's more services that are being provided post-adoption. There's a need to continue to provide even more and to fund those well. But we can encourage birth parents to have conversations with medical providers as part of that decision making. What are the implications of this? If you find out that your child has a medical condition or has different chromosomes and is say going to perhaps have Down syndrome or some other situation, meet with a medical provider, meet with families or organizations that really specialize this, so you can make a decision about parenting or placing your child for adoption, or depending on the state you live in and what other options you have. But that should be a fully informed decision to know, what are the implications for me, what are the implications for my child.
I'm sitting next to a fabulous legal professor who can answer the legal aspect, but from the real world aspect, doctors are not recommending adoption. Doctors are recommending abortion often and not early on in pregnancy, and they are not recommending adoption. We're seeing late term in delivery. We're seeing labor and delivery nurses who are talking birth moms out of adoption. In the hospital, when they've already made an adoption plan, 50% of all adoptions fail because labor and delivery nurses talk them out of the adoption.
Really?
Which is crazy. When they've been trained from the organization that Ryan was talking about, I think is maybe one or others, once they've been trained in what adoption is really about, that changes dramatically, but they're not trained. And so they don't know. They're labor and delivery nurses. All they see is the day that an adoption takes place. It's really sad for the birth mom. And it is. The baby left with another couple. That's a tough day. It doesn't mean adoption is not a good thing. Mm-hmm. And so you get labor and delivery nurses who are talking people out of what could be the greatest thing for that child and that birth mother. Mm-hmm. Because they don't want to see that day.
So I'm just curious in terms of research, how did you find this out about the nurse's role in this?
That was the training, the feedback it was from the agencies that are giving us the feedback on the failed adoptions. It was the training from the group that Ryan's talking about is where I learned that. And the others from dealing with the doctors.
I see, okay. Elizabeth, did you want to add
Yeah,
something?
I have very little to add. I think that I just might broaden the conversation from doctors to say that I do think there's this, as I've said, I think there's a soft stigma against the choice of adoption. I think it's basically a non-option for most women. I think that there is an enormous amount of misunderstandings and, that can be through adequate training, adequate education, addressed, right? But there also, we have to acknowledge that there are those who are against adoption, who think it's unnatural, who want to thwart it. I have anecdotal experience. Our 3 hospital experiences were wildly different. One actively tried to change the birth mother's mind. Every shift change, the nurses came in and asked her the same set of questions, causing her to revisit her decision over and over, to the other end of the spectrum where we got our own room, where we were allowed to, have the baby with, skin-to-skin contact. It was just completely different. And I suspect training was involved in the good experience. But this transcends the medical community. I think I have some experience with trying to promote in the context of informed consent. So when a woman goes for an abortion, she has to be given informed consent materials about the nature of the proceeding, the risk to her, et cetera. And in many places, it's required to give her information about her alternatives. So that the father of the baby is liable for child support. Here's, if you need help with parenting, here's all the resources. Very, very few of those laws have any information about adoption. And so I was involved in Louisiana and Arizona with enhancing those laws. It's not coercive, it's just information given to women about the choice of adoption. I was just so sad that it was a completely partisan effort. There was absolute resistance on one side to women having access to accurate, non-coercive information about adoption. So I think we have to recognize there's misunderstandings, but there's also a kind of active anti-adoption sentiment at work.
Yeah.
Can I say
Okay.
more about that? Because that's actually one of the concerns that I have post-Dobbs, is that we're seeing even more of this, where we aren't actually having a conversation about adoption when we are pretending to. It's being used as a proxy to talk about abortion. And I think when we're talking about what good adoption practices are, we should actually be having a real conversation about adoption. We should be talking about what it looks like to ensure that birth parents are fully informed, that they're not coerced, that it's non-directive, that they are, that they're making a decision that's good for them and that's good for their child. And we don't have to have an environment where it becomes politically charged. And I think, unfortunately, we're seeing this really on both sides, where we're cherry picking stories and examples and using that to highlight, John mentioned, stories that are reflecting adoption practices from 100 years ago. He's absolutely right. That's happening in major media pieces are describing adoption the way it looked like, from our grandparents' generation or prior. On the other hand, we can't oversimplify adoption, and we can't just say things like, well, she can just place her child for adoption, as though it's that simple, as though there aren't short-term and long-term consequences for everyone that's involved with that adoption decision. We need to have a conversation about adoption that's truly about adoption if we're going to set good policies and practices in place.
I agree with you, Ryan. We need to be able to talk about adoption that way and be able to present that. I do think that the pro-abortion community views it as a competitor. I think the adoption world doesn't necessarily think of itself as a competitor in that regard, but I think because it is viewed by some on that side, that's where the attacks come from. And that's where so much of the dialogue comes from, and that is where it gets elevated. And I do think that's where we see attacks coming against adoption.
I just wanted to ask one last question of all of you, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. I wanted to get into the question of the openness of adoption now, and kind of what some of your survey results were in terms of the arrangements that birth parents have with adoptive families. To sort of get into how this doesn't look anything like it did 100 years ago, and just what you found. Were people happy with the amount of contact that they had with birth parents for their adoptive children, and what are kind of some of the typical arrangements that we're seeing now?
Yeah, so it's a great question. By type of adoption, it changes dramatically. Often when we're having this conversation, we're talking about private domestic adoption, and that's again where we saw this huge shift over time, where now the vast majority, 3/4, and I think it's even more because this is really a trajectory, are relationships that have ongoing contact and relationships that are really meaningful. We also ask them if they answered no, that they don't have that relationship, would they want contact with the birth family if possible? And the majority do. The majority of adoptive families would like contact if they don't have it. Yeah, if they don't currently have it, we ask them, would you want contact? And the majority said yes. Mm-hmm. So this is already the vast majority do, and for those that don't, they want that. And what is the ongoing, when you say ongoing contact, what does that look like? It ranges so broadly, it's hard to say. It could be that they are meeting in person on a regular basis. It could be that they are exchanging phone calls, so they're meeting a few times a year. Every family is going to look different, the way most of us, all have different relationships with our extended families. But it means that this isn't just one and done, or they don't just know the names and they're never talking, that they are engaging in an ongoing relationship. Mm-hmm. And that's the way we phrased it when we asked the question was, do you have ongoing contact? Mm-hmm. Did you want to add anything? John, did you want to add?
Elizabeth, you want to
No, I mean, I would just, yeah, I think, the one thing I would note, although it's the majority, it is, the answer to that second question, whether you'd want contact if you don't have it, does drop significantly for families who adopt from foster care. So I think that's an interesting difference to point out, and obviously there's likely a vast difference to account for the desired ongoing relationship, since to account for the circumstances that children end up in foster care. I think it's just worth noting that, and you probably know this off the top of your head, the number of states that enforce agreements. Do you?
I don't know.
You don't. Okay.
Many
Yeah.
do. They have.
Enforce the contact agreements that are
Right,
agreed
exactly.
upon at
So-
the adoption.
And I just think that's important that birth mothers understand, right? We do want to focus on agency. We do want to emphasize that it's not your grandmother's, adoption world, right? That you have this agency, but it is the case, as a matter of law, that adoption severs legally the relationship between the birth family and the child, and the adoptive parents become, for all legal purposes, the parents. And so therefore, except in those states where there are enforceable agreements, if the adoptive family, for whatever reason, doesn't want to facilitate that contact, it won't happen.
Right.
And I think that's important for a birth mother to fully understand. We don't want to overemphasize openness and act as if this isn't a reality
Right.
from the legal perspective.
Right.
From 1994 to 1996, I went through 2 different private investigation firms, 2 different law firms, getting a court order against the state of Colorado to issue a sealed birth certificate, and ultimately found my birth mother. So I had an open adoption from that day forward, right? The shame and guilt that she had greatly diminished when I met her, right? It's that openness, the openness that eliminates shame and guilt. So I think of that as an open adoption that took 40 years before there was the first communication, right? And so when I talk about open adoption today, I think we shouldn't have to wait 40 years. Some is what Ryan was talking about, that it happens from the very beginning, or Elizabeth is talking about with her children, that it happens from the very beginning. So there's different levels of it. We all think about open as being right at the beginning, right? When the birth family first adopts this kid, and I think of open might be at 21 years old when this kid's meeting his birth parents. I don't, everything is in between. But I think the whole idea of communicating it with open is about opening up relationships and having those lines of contact. Even the ones who don't have lines of contact, I think Elizabeth would agree with maybe one of her children that birth mother has a line of contact, has an ability to communicate if she wants to. It's not having to hire people and go through searches and different things to do it. I think the more that we're open with adoption, the more we're eliminating the shame and guilt that's around it. It's amazing that we can eliminate shame and guilt in so many other areas of our society, but we keep it in adoption.
Yeah.
And John's experience is not abnormal, and he's absolutely right. We can't tell any birth parent that they can have absolute, confidentiality in their decision making. DNA testing has taken that away. There are fewer sealed records. There's, the rise of social media. There's just no ability to offer that, and that's not a bad thing. That can be, as John's alluding to, that can be a really good thing. I think Elizabeth's point is also well taken. We need to, the important thing here is making sure she understands the implications, and she understands we can't be over-promising. We can't promise all of that outcomes in the future, especially we're talking about a relationship, which is, something that is built
Human
over time.
beings, yes, exactly.
That's right.
But we're not going to have an ability to, not that any of us would want to go back to the way it used to be, but that world is gone, and there's that level of secrecy is not coming back.
The investigator that I use is starving today because DNA has eliminated how hard that search used to be.
We'll have to expand into DNA analysis.
Yeah.
All right, great. All right, well, we're going to open it up for some questions from the audience. We have a microphone coming around, so if you can just wait for the microphone and then give us your name and ask a question, please. Go ahead. Here.
Hey, thank you all so much for being here. My name is Virginia Allen, and I'm a reporter with the Daily Signal just down the street. And I was curious to hear from you all, as we're talking about adoption and the narrative adoption in a post-Roe world, what is the role that you think the media plays in shifting public opinion around the issue of adoption, and what are the stories that you think members of the media really need to be telling in order to be a part of that shift?
Yeah, so I appreciate that question. I've been pretty critical of the media, where I think you shouldn't be able to know exactly what the reporter's ideology is by the time you're done with the article. And it, again, as I was saying earlier, the stories are written in such a way where it seems that adoption is really a proxy for abortion. And I think if we can remove that, we can give accurate information about what adoption looks like, and we can incorporate, I think including anecdotes and stories is very helpful, and it's often more interesting to readers, but nestle that also within the context of the larger picture. How many adoptions are happening? How many of them are open? If I'm reading a story about an adoption relationship or that fell apart, or a birth parent who was promised one thing and didn't receive that, I think it would be helpful to know for the public who doesn't have this information that that's not the norm. That's a rare situation, and I see less and less of that when I'm reading stories now. I'm reading a story about adoption, and I think this is actually about abortion, or this is actually about the child welfare system, or this is actually about a different issue, and it's not about adoption itself.
I would actually echo that, I think, but it's not just abortion that the stories are really about. Sometimes the stories are really about race, for instance, and adoption is a way for someone to hammer home a point that they want to make about race. And there was an anecdote that happened recently that I wanted to share because I think it's illustrative of this. I gave a speech recently at a university, and I mentioned in the speech there have been studies of kind of the outcomes of transracial adoption, and what they found was that there wasn't a lot of difference in the long-term outcomes for black children who've been adopted by white families or black children who've been adopted by black families. They measured income and education and self-esteem. I mentioned this in the speech, and afterwards a couple of young people came up to me, both college students, and one of them said, well, that wasn't my experience, and I went to high school and I was a different race from my parents, and I didn't feel prepared for my environment in a variety of ways, and and that's obviously that person's experience. And then the person next to them, who was also black, said, I had that too. I had that experience too. I felt like I was out of place in my high school, and I didn't feel comfortable in a variety of ways. And I said, oh, you were also adopted transracially? And the person said, no, I wasn't adopted. And I said, so maybe this is not a story about adoption, and maybe it's not even a story about race. And I was trying not to be condescending, but I sort of said, a lot of people go to high school and feel uncomfortable. Like I said, I was not trying to be patronizing. I just said, this is actually kind of a common human experience that, as we get older, like we find like maybe we haven't found the right people to hang out with, or we feel, uncomfortable, out of place in a variety of ways. But when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so if all you want to talk about is racial differences and problems that result from racial differences, you're going to look at adoption that way. You're going to look at a whole bunch of issues through that lens. And so I worry that in the same way that adoption is being used to talk about abortion, adoption is also being used to talk about a variety of other issues. Other questions?
Hi, my name is Malka Groden. I'm an adoptive mother, and I wonder if you can comment on the pipeline of adoption professionals, pro-adoption, or at least not anti-adoption, adoption professionals. In my personal experience, a lot of the troubles that I went through actually came from the very people that were supposed to be supporting me, social workers, many of whom worked at private adoption agencies. So is there some organization working on this? Is there a philanthropist that's excited about this? I wonder if you can comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, do you mind if I ask what type of adoption you pursued?
Yeah, I had 3 private domestic adoptions.
Okay, yeah. So that's a great question. I think the field has changed over time, and it's going to range from one agency to the next. Every state, and here in DC, there's going to be laws for what the training and requirements are for those workers, and those are minimum standards that should, of course, be well exceeded. And my organization and others, do work to put resources out for adoption professionals so that they can be better informed about what they're doing. There are conferences. We host a large conference every year where workers can network with one another, learn from one another, and to grow in their experiences. And I would say, if you had negative experiences, use that for others to learn from. Help them learn from that. Help us learn from that so that that doesn't happen to other future families.
I would just add, of course, I can't remember the name of the book, but there was a really interesting book several years ago on this idea that personnel is policy, right? I mean, many of us focus on what best law and what best policy, but if you don't have professionals who are actually delivering that policy in a way that's effective, then it doesn't really matter what the law or policy is. And it examined this question in the context of child welfare. So your experience with private domestic adoption might be slightly different, but looking at the fact that how poorly trained, how low pay, the workers in the child welfare system are, may account for some of the problems rather than the laws and policies. So I can follow up with you with the text, but it was a really interesting in-depth analysis of this question of the role that personnel plays in delivering the policy.
Oh, just can you wait for the microphone? Thanks.
Yeah, I have a question about your data. In the end, it's self-selected. What have you done or been able to do, or what thoughts have you given to where your data is not representative of the community of adoptive families?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. You're absolutely right that it is. The alternative is something like the National Survey of Adoptive Parents that came out over a decade ago that the federal government funded. I think it was an awesome survey, and I think having, I wish they were able to do that again. They weren't. It was part of a larger study. So what I would say is we were aware of that from the get-go, and we were mindful of that when we built the survey and when we continued to determine when to cut off hearing from adoptive parents. So the methodology that we went about was that we really sought to get a diverse number of other organizations. So it wasn't just folks who were connected to us in some manner to hear from them. We asked them to share it within their networks. We looked at the response rates we were getting to see that we heard from families in all 50 states plus Washington, D.C. For all types of adoption. And I think the large sample size that we have is also an ability to have confidence in what we said. But you'll also see in the limitation section that we direct that we address that question directly, that this is not a census of the United States where we were able to take all the respondents and just look at those who responded. We asked adoptive parents to be responsive to us, and so like any survey, including surveys where things are ostensibly representative, there's going to be some limitations because individuals choose not to respond, and we would all have that option when given a survey.
Ryan, there's a lot of things that the federal government ought to be funding that they're not. Not the least of which is what y'all just paid for with your by the numbers report. The federal government quit counting private infant adoption in 1975. And we wonder why it's dropped down to 20,000 versus 1 million abortions. I mean, we don't count it. They're not doing surveys. They're not even doing counts. They don't even require the states to report the counts to them. There's a number of initiatives like that that Elizabeth's involved in and has chronicled that they need to be doing.
Let me ask you, were there big disparities in some ways between what your findings were and what the federal study found?
Not in terms of the demographics. I think that's one of the reasons we had some confidence in it. But there were some, and I think what we wanted to do is ask different questions than what the National Survey of Adoptive Parents was asking. So they asked questions about, they had a lot of demographic information, as does our study, and we asked about adoption practices, what were the costs, what were your experiences, how did you like your service providers? We asked a lot of those questions along the way that weren't part of the other previous survey.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to add that in this policy paper that I mentioned at the end of my remarks, I call for enhanced data collection and recording and reporting. It's not a very exciting legislative initiative, so it doesn't tend to get much support or funding. But I absolutely think, we might all have really good ideas about what laws or policies might help move the needle on the number of adoptions, but without that kind of data, it'll be very difficult to demonstrate effectiveness or, impact.
Any other questions? Okay, great. Well, did you have a question? Go ahead, sorry.
I was just curious on the nature of the competition that the abortion side views with adoption. Is that competition just moral or cultural, or is there like a threat to business sort of competition there?
I think that's the way I just paraphrase the attacks that seem to happen and where they seem to come from, is where I characterize that as viewing it as competition, because it's out of the nature of how adoption really works today. It's using a lot of the old stereotypes of adoption as ways of attacking it. So that's just a little bit of how it feels, and maybe that's my characterization of that.
Okay, great. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists for today. And